through 198 methods. Here with a Saturday update. It's been a busy week, especially in sort of utility law and news. And so we wanted to put a bunch of updates together that all kind of sprang from this tweet thread I had earlier in the week, and talk about some upcoming actions as well. So bear with us. We'll talk you through a couple of slides and tell you what's been going on. So to start, it started with this tweet I saw. It was retweeted by someone from Evergreen Action, one of the national groups that helped write and pass the Inflation Reduction Act policy. And it was looking at this sort of semi-scholarly article from a place called RMI, which is like a think tank. And they were looking at, in turn, one of the first integrated resource plans, or IRPs, from a utility that specifically is after the Inflation Reduction Act has been passed, and which makes reference to the Inflation Reduction Act, and especially all the tax credits it has for things like renewable energy and carbon capture and all kinds of other stuff in there. So I went and read the article, and I think it's safe to say, you know, Evergreen, RMI, lots of folks in the kind of utility policy world were pretty excited about this integrated resource plan. I'm a little bit more suspicious of it for the same reasons I've been a little suspicious of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we thought we'd put together sort of a synopsis of that tweet thread and why, and then also expand on it a little bit and tell you some of what's coming next. So I wrote this long tweet thread that was basically sort of a critique or a rebuttal to the RMI article. I'm not disagreeing with the findings in the article. What they report is what the utilities IRP, their resource plan, says. And they mostly are reading it as kind of like hopeful. It's a good sign. And I'm going, there's some reasons for skepticism in there. But my pushback on that apparently struck a nerve, because the same guy who'd originally tweeted the thing, Sam from Evergreen Action, wrote me this message back that he was kind of annoyed at me for making this comment, and that it shouldn't be critiquing the policy because, you know, in his perception, I hadn't done enough to help support the Inflation Reduction Act becoming law. So let's talk about it for a minute, because I do think there's a line of critique here, and it does express a difference of opinion about how to go forward. Nobody's saying the Inflation Reduction Act shouldn't have passed or didn't pass. It's there. It's in law. The president signed it last summer, and we have to figure out what to do with it. And so where Sam and I essentially disagree, or Evergreen Action and 198 Methods disagree, insofar as we're completely different organizations in totally different parts of the universe, you know, where we have a disagreement is about where to focus and what we think the opportunities and challenges are of the post-Inflation Reduction Act world for things like utilities. And also we'll talk a little bit about FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which we do a lot of campaigning at, and things like that. So let's start with that RMI piece that was looking at the integrated resource plan, the IRP, from a place called DTE Energy, which is a big energy company in Michigan, one of the big utilities out there. And in particular, it has this great graph in the RMI piece. There's a link to it in the blog post that goes with this video. Go read it if you like. And one of the key things that it's showing, you can see in this thing, the dark blue bar in this graph is the price that the utility would have paid for electricity from this source before the Inflation Reduction Act. And then the light blue bar is after the Inflation Reduction Act. And you'll notice all the different kinds of energy are cheaper post-Inflation Reduction Act, which is great. That's what the Inflation Reduction Act was supposed to do, right? Is through tax incentives and credits and things like that, make the price, especially of renewable power, and that's the two over here, or this wrong, right? This one on the end is solar, and then the one next to it over here is wind. And those two do in fact come down quite a bit. And you'll see they're quite cost competitive with the ones farther on the other side over here. That's gas, essentially different kinds of gas with different kinds of carbon capture attached. So short version, this is good news. And in particular in the report, it does specifically say that if approved, this is still a proposed integrated resource plan. So the State Utility Commission will have to review it and approve it for it to go into effect. But if it's approved, they would scale up to 15 gigawatts of solar power by 2042. And that's an increase to about 60% of the total electricity that utility generates, up from about 10% today, which is great. And that they would build out more renewable energy across the system. It's not in this particular quote, but they do also say that they would retire a coal-fired power plant that's part of the utilities portfolio now, earlier than they had expected to. Their last integrated resource plan was in 2019. This one's being written late 2022, early 2023, so about 4 years later. And it says that they would speed up the pace with which they phase out coal. So that's the really good news part of this. There's nothing, and I don't disagree at all with RMI or Evergreen or anybody else about that. The good part about this, and a good part about the Inflation Reduction Act, is it probably will cause utilities in the US to slightly speed up the pace at which they retire coal in particular. It may also, and that plan did show that they were going to put a lot of money and investment into gas with carbon capture, which is kind of a risky bet because there are no operating natural gas power plants in the world with a functioning carbon capture system right now. This is a totally theoretical technology, could work, could be great. We don't know because it's never actually happened yet. But that's what they're putting a lot of money into. And then they are spending a bunch of money as well on renewables, especially solar power and wind, because those were the cheapest options post-IRA, post-Inflation Reduction Act, for them to invest in. So this is all good, right? But key thing I want you to keep your eye on is that 60% of the portfolio, right? And that they're going to get there by 2042. What's the problem we keep saying with the Inflation Reduction Act and with all of these utility plans that are coming out post-Inflation Reduction Act is that they're basically not doing enough and they're not doing it fast enough. So Michigan in particular, last year, the governor announced a plan that the state would get 60% of its renewable electricity, same as the DTE plan, but that they would get there by 2030. So essentially this plan is 12 years later, 12 years longer to get to the same goal as what the governor has already said is the mission and the goal and the law of the state. So this utility plan shouldn't be in compliance with other state goals and rules. And when we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, remember folks were saying that it was going to get us, what Biden promised was that he would cut global warming pollution 50% by 2030. So there's that 2030 date again. And again, if you got 60% renewable energy, right, that would be a good part of that plan. Biden also said he was going to get to 100% renewable energy in the electric sector, which is what we're talking about with these utility plans, by 2035. And obviously this plan would be nowhere near that goal because it wouldn't get to 60% until 2042. Even if they could make it go faster and meet the governor's goal and get to 60% by 2030, they still wouldn't be supplying 100% of their energy with renewables. And they'd be betting a lot on that gas with carbon capture and sequestration to make up the difference between those two things. And it's just a totally unproven technology at this point. But it's a technology that the Inflation Reduction Act incentivizes because, again, the other problem with the Inflation Reduction Act that we've been talking about for months and months now is that they cut out this thing called the Clean Electricity Payment Program. And so originally when Biden proposed the idea, it was called Build Back Better. If you remember, there was this whole idea it was going to have a Build Back Better agenda, and it was going to have a lot to do with restructuring the economy around those big carbon goals. And so this chart is from more than a year ago now, the early days of Build Back Better in 2021 and the first part of 2022. They were still talking about writing a set of policies that would reduce global warming pollution 45% by 2030. So again, not all the way to the 50% by 2030 goal, but as a specific way to make progress on it. That's what they were talking about at the early days of the Inflation Reduction Act. But they stripped out a big part of it. Because the biggest piece of this pie is Clean Electricity Payment Program. That got eliminated because Joe Manchin in particular hated that idea because it would have made the phase out of coal happen even faster than it does with the other Inflation Reduction Act. But they left in the clean energy tax incentives. So the actual, what we've been debating these last couple of months since the Inflation Reduction Act passed is going back to this previous one, right? So the blue bar at the top here is like what we think will happen if we do nothing, or which we're not going to do literally nothing, but if we hadn't passed anything like the Inflation Reduction Act, that was the range of possibilities. They thought global warming pollution would come down kind of on its own or as a result of other policies that the government has already enacted, 24 to 35% by 2030. So still coming down some, but nowhere near the 50% level. And then with the Inflation Reduction Act, what they're saying is that that reduction will actually be between 30 and 45%. So they think it'll get back to that around 45% less by 2050, but they're missing a big part of the plan, right, which was the Clean Energy Payment Program. And the key thing that I was saying in my tweet thread that's different between these two is the Clean Electricity Payment Program was both a tax incentive, so it gave money for them to invest in things and therefore made the price cheaper, and also a penalty program. You had to pay higher taxes as a utility company if you kept relying on coal, especially, but also natural gas that didn't have the carbon capture stuff attached to it. So it wasn't just that we were trying to make it a little bit cheaper and encourage them to invest into and explore the technology of carbon capture, which is what we're doing now. It was that there was actually a penalty. If they didn't get it right, if they couldn't prove that they were reducing carbon emissions, they were going to have to pay a fine. And that was going to be a big incentive to make them do it and to actually deliver on the carbon reduction goals. One of the things Joe Manchin said was there would be no sticks. They call them carrots and sticks. So the carrots is like a tax credit. You get a little investment, you get a cheaper tax rate if you do a good thing. But we don't have any more of the sticks, which was the penalties and the fines and the higher taxes if you did a bad thing or if you tried to do a thing and failed. So another thing about these new integrated resource plans that are going to come out is that there is no consequence for the utility company to say they're going to invest in a natural gas plant with carbon capture if it totally doesn't work. And same thing with small nuclear and other things. A bunch of utilities have experimented with these technologies for years. They have spent fortunes of money on them and they have never worked. There's a coal-fired power plant in the Southeast, which has been saying it's going to run a carbon capture coal plant for years, and it's just never worked. And it's basically, we keep putting money into it, putting money into it, putting money into it, and it just doesn't actually reduce pollution. Another big problem with the carbon capture on natural gas plants is that what you'd be doing is you'd be capturing the carbon at the smokestack. And natural gas does produce a lot less carbon dioxide and other kinds of air pollution than coal does at the point of combustion. But what that doesn't account for is all the methane. Natural gas just is methane, all the methane that leaks out in the system. And we know fracking wells leak a ton of methane. The transportation system, the pipelines, liquefaction facilities, compressor stations, all of these things leak a ton of methane. And while there are some new rules being considered at the EPA to kind of crack down on that and tighten up on methane leaks, nobody is proposing that we would ever get to zero emissions of methane, zero leaks of methane in the system. And so that means you're always going to be adding pollution that's outside of the smokestack, even if you were able to capture 98 or 100% of the carbon at the smokestack, you'd still have a bunch of other pollution from the gas power plant. And you'd still have a bunch of other stuff like pipelines and compressor stations that are being railroaded through communities by agencies like FERC and are doing their own damage to the environment and to our communities, right? So really not the perfect solution. We often call these false solutions or extractive solutions because they still rely on the same basic principles of pollution and extraction and taking land from communities and using eminent domain and this kind of stuff. Whereas solar is just an investment strategy. You put solar on a house or you put solar in a community, you're adding value to it. Yes, you have to put some land up to do that. You have to have a roof if you're a homeowner, but it is fundamentally an investment-based strategy, not a extraction-based strategy to create electricity from solar power as opposed to from any kind of natural gas or any kind of fossil fuel. So here's that chart again, just so you can kind of see it and get your head around it. So what we're saying is the Inflation Reduction Act, good news is it has made all kinds of energy cheaper. That includes the solar and the wind, which is the stuff we want, but it also includes the stuff we don't want, which is natural gas, especially, and natural gas with this speculative carbon capture technology attached. I was also saying in my tweet thread that the DET energy plan, this Michigan energy plan that we were reviewing in the original article, you know, it's not great. And basically it has a lot of these speculative carbon capture investments. And even with all that stuff, it doesn't get all the way to the goals that the president and the governor of Michigan and other people have already said we need to get to. But it could be worse too. And as an example, I'm pointing at the North Carolina Utilities Commission just approved a Duke Energy carbon plan that was written last year. Now this is different. This is not an integrated resource plan, but the state of North Carolina did pass a law saying that we were going to eliminate global warming pollution from the power sector over the next couple of decades. And they set some specific goals, and they said the utility commission had to come up with a plan working with the state's biggest utility, Duke Energy, for how to do that. Well, they put out the plan last year, and advocates in North Carolina gave it an F. And we did a whole drive, for many of you saw, to send comments to North Carolina Utility Commission telling them to reject Duke Energy's plan and force the utility to put up a real plan that would actually eliminate carbon. It's also worth noting that the Duke Energy plan was a lot like the DT Energy plan in that it had a huge investment in gas. It said it would figure out stuff about carbon capture later, but it did also include a little bit more investment, especially in offshore wind. The Duke Energy plan, though, is worse than the DT Energy plan in that it's pretty hostile to solar power. And what they specifically say is they don't want to build more solar and they don't want to invest in more solar capacity for their customers in North Carolina. And they want to instead invest in gas and then eventually gas with carbon capture. So this is the bad news, or that was the bad news you would think, but it's actually not it gets worse. It's the short answer. And it's been one of these weeks where it's just the news keeps getting worse and worse. So this chart is drawn from another report that was came out just this week called Powerless in the US. And it was looking at utility companies that shut off power to their customers, turn off the lights, turn off the heat because folks haven't paid a bill, right? But there's no reason in the year 2023 that we have to have these aggressive shutoff plans. And what the report found is that actually there's a couple of corporations that are especially bad about this. Just 12 utilities did the vast majority of shutting off power to their customers 4.9 million times. And those same companies also returned huge dividends to their investors and to their CEOs and to the top executives at the company. And just 1% of those dividends could have more than paid the bills for all 4.9 billion people that they shut off the lights to. And as you can probably guess where this is going to go, both of the companies we've been talking about were some of the worst corporations in this new report for energy shutoffs and for payouts to executives and investors. So DT Energy, the Michigan company we started looking at, has shut off power to more than 378,000 customers in the last couple of years. And they've spent more than $2.1 billion paying their investors and their shareholders dividends. So they're clearly making a choice, shutting off power to customers, penalizing customers, and then taking the money that they have and they're giving it back as dividends. And then they're going to invest mostly in natural gas and fossil fuels and other things, not in meeting the state's carbon goals. And then same thing, but even worse with Duke Energy. Duke Energy has shut off power to more than 600,000 households in the last couple of years and gave $8.3 billion back to investors and shareholders. So even more of the same trend, basically, that what's driving these companies, what's motivating these companies' actions is not safe and reliable electricity service to customers, because they're shutting off power to a lot of people who don't, when they don't pay their bills. Their investment or their focus is on investors and on returning profit. So this is just a classic example of corporations that put profit over people and profit over the planet. And we see this over and over and over again in how they do their shutoffs and how they do their investor relations and their dividend payouts and in how they do their integrated resource planning and their carbon planning. They are not doing this for the benefit of the people. They are doing this to make as much money as they possibly can, and they do not care if people get shut off, if people lose access to electricity. They are not in the business of reliably providing power to everybody who wants it. They're in the business of making money. So one other thing that was, this is an older report from late last year from Chisholm Legacy Project, which was great. The people who are reviewing these plans, the DET Integrated Resource Plan and the Duke Energy Carbon Plan that I was talking about, those are state utility commissions. It's the North Carolina Utility Commission, or sometimes they're called public utility commissions, PUCs. They have different names in different states, and there are 50 different of them, and they all work a little bit different from each other. There's one for every state. That's the people who are overseeing these kind of things as public utility commissions. And this report from Chisholm Legacy Project does a great job of laying out, if you haven't run into your state's PUC, if you don't know what we're talking about with integrated resource plans, this is a great report to read, because it lays out really clearly, the basics of what these commissions are, how they work. And it looks in particular at the structure of the commissions, how they are put together. How long do people have terms? What's the demographic backgrounds of people? How many folks are on there representing communities of color or women or low-income ratepayers versus profitable corporations and industry. And also at the size of the commissions. Most states have a 3-member commission. A couple of them have different ones. Most places they're appointed, usually by the governor, but some states they're independently elected, like in Georgia. And in some states, they have a sort of hybrid model where somebody gets elected and then the PUC is appointed by them. And this also bears a striking resemblance to FERC at the federal level, which is sort of the analog for a PUC. They don't have the exact same kind of powers, but they are the agency of the federal government, which looks at these same things. They look at the electricity sector across state lines, and they look at the natural gas sector, again, across state lines. They don't have direct control over coal as a commodity or a product, but because coal is mostly burned for electricity these days, not for heating, for example, or other uses like that, they're kind of the main agency at the federal level. And they have that same kind of structure, right? It's a 5-member commission. They're appointed by the president, which is, like a national version of a governor, right? It's the executive branch makes the appointment. And then they have a Senate confirmation because they're a federal appointee. We've been telling you about FERC for a while, so this may be familiar. You can think of your local PUC like a miniature FERC, right? Like a state level FERC, just for the sake of kind of getting your head around the powers and the kind of things that they consider and approve. And also to understand the problem, which is our problem with FERC has always been not that they don't have the right powers or they should have more power. The problem is they only ever say yes to what the utility companies and the gas companies put in front of them. In this, in FERC case, it usually looks like anytime somebody proposes a natural gas pipeline, FERC almost always says yes. And that's a real problem, because even if you can show them, hey, this natural gas plant isn't even needed, you don't need this natural gas pipeline, or we, the people whose land would be crossed by the natural gas pipeline, object to our land being used in this way. Even if you say, hey, there's all these environmental or climate impacts of the pipeline project, FERC always says yes to the pipeline, no matter what kinds of comments and evidence and things are presented to them. And for the last several months, about the last year, they've really been on a backsliding trend, which is to say they've been getting weaker and weaker and weaker. So last month, BXC, our friends at Beyond Extreme Energy, put out this report showing that since Joe Manchin intervened in the middle of 2022 to order FERC to take back some proposed rules to consider climate and environmental impacts, they've approved the equivalent of 76 new coal-fired power plants worth of pollution, 282 million tons of carbon equivalent from all these different projects. And again, that's the result of them just rubber stamping permit after permit and project after project. And the same thing basically happens at the state level with the utility commissions. That carbon plan from Duke Energy clearly didn't meet the state's carbon goals, clearly was just going to build a lot of natural gas. It was actually going to inhibit the development of solar energy in the state in particular, but the state's utility commission rubber stamped it because Duke Energy had proposed it. The DET energy plan, still under consideration. They haven't made a decision on it either way, but historically, the utility commission almost always just approves those plans, even when they run directly contrary to the goals that the governor has set out, right? So in North Carolina, the state legislature passed a bipartisan bill saying we want to reduce carbon emissions. Duke Energy said, we don't want to do that. We're not going to write you a plan to do that. And the utility commission let them. In Michigan, we haven't got a final ruling, but there's no evidence to suggest that the utility commission is going to be the one to stand up to DET Energy and say, hey, this plan is good, but it's not good enough. We need you to increase renewables more. We need you to cut dividends and invest that money into renewable energy and into low-income households, and to stop shutting off the power to customers. There's never been that kind of intervention from the state utility commissions. And unfortunately, the news at FERC just keeps getting worse and worse. So again, just this week, we got news that the new acting chairman, Willie Phillips, has decided to make even less environmental review of natural gas projects. And there's a link to this article in there, so you don't have to try and read this long thing, which has docket numbers in it behind my head. But the short version is what they're doing is they're going from using an environmental impact statement, which is a longer and somewhat more impartial review. Typically, an environmental impact statement is not written by the company that's proposing a pipeline or a project. It's an independent consultant comes in and says, well, here's all the environmental impacts, you know, all the groundwater that might be polluted, all the endangered species that might be disturbed, the impact on the air, on the climate, all that kind of stuff, and that it would be at least a little bit more impartial. They want to go back instead to what they were mostly doing under the Trump administration and before, which is only requiring an environmental assessment. Environmental assessments often are written by the same company, and it really is just a kind of like yes or no. It's not quite that simple, but it's a much simpler version of the environmental impact statement, which basically just says, you know, will your project have an impact on the environment? Yes or no, how much? And the company can kind of say, no, we don't think it'll have a big impact on the environment. The other big difference between environmental impact statement and environmental assessment is that environmental assessments have many fewer opportunities for public comment. So what you'll see under this new system going forward with FERC is that projects that are under consideration right now at FERC, like we've been talking for a couple of months about the GTN Express pipeline that runs kind of through Oregon and Idaho and parts of Canada and into California on the West Coast. And they want to expand the capacity of the pipeline. If they were allowed, for example, to use an environmental assessment instead of an environmental impact statement, the company would be under way less pressure from FERC to actually go out and interview community members, do surveys in the area, look at what the actual biodiversity is in the lands that they're crossing, because it's a long pipeline route. It's going to go through a bunch of different watersheds. And so you might want a more fulsome environmental impact statement, both so the public had more time to comment on it, and so you got a more detailed look at all along the pipeline route, what would be the impacts of this big project. Environmental assessment will basically let the companies behind GTN Express say, we don't think it's going to have a big pipeline, big impact on the environment. And in fact, we already have a pipeline here. It's an expansion project, not a new pipeline project. So you don't even have to worry about it. And FERC presumably would say aye and rubber stamp that permit, as they have all these other permits over the last several months. And then it gets even worse again, which is this week. We got a lot of what the gas expansion that we talk about at FERC is really about export. It's not about local natural gas power plants. And one of the big kind of push-pull conflicts in renewable energy and energy policy for the last year or two has been we keep increasing the amount of natural gas, frac gas that we export overseas. We're saying that that's because the war in Ukraine means that Europe needs more gas, and so we have to scale up production. Actually, most of the gas that the US produces goes to Asia, and that's where it's mostly going because they pay a higher price for it. And it is true that some gas is going to Europe and the EU, and that there have been some deals and things to expand that. But one of the big problems too is here in the US is every time we build one of these big export facilities and we send more gas abroad, it makes the price of natural gas here in the US go up. And so that's why fuel prices and electricity prices were really high in a lot of parts of the US this winter. Where I live in New England, our electric grid is very heavily dependent on natural gas. And we don't have a lot of it here in New England, so it all has to be piped in and shipped in from somewhere. And because they were doing so much to expand exports of natural gas, it really made the price of gas go up and the price of electricity go up a lot in the winter in New England, in the ISO New England region. And one of the things that actually brought it back down was there was an explosion last summer at this big export facility in Freeport, Texas. And remember, we've talked about this at FERC, and we've had folks on from Freeport to some of our webinars and things to tell this story or talk about it from the first person. But there was this huge explosion. We still don't know exactly what went wrong at the plant. But this week, FERC has begun approving permission for Freeport to reopen and, in fact, to expand. They call these things trains, which is the sort of process of liquefying the gas to get it onto a big tanker and shipped overseas. And they have approved a new third train opening, and they're on their way this week to approving the reopening of the entire facility. Still haven't told the community what new safety rules or what went wrong and what they may have changed. But before they get to that explanation, they have already said that they're going to allow the plant to reopen and continue exporting gas and expand export even more gas. And then this is another great visualizing article. I encourage you to go look at it, which is looking at that trend in gas exports. And you can see where a lot of these new gas export facilities, the gas is all over, some in what we call the Permian Basin, which is kind of out there to the west of Texas, and a lot of it in the Marcellus Shale region of around Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio. But all the export facilities are in the Gulf, or almost all of them. And so all that gas has to get onto pipelines, right, to get shipped down there. And that's why we keep running into these problems. And what the gas company, what the utility companies are saying in all these integrated resource plans and all of these carbon plans that they are submitting is that they are betting that they will get a piece of that gas, that the gas that goes to export, that they'll be able to pull off a little bit of it as it goes by the pipeline, and that's why it's so cheap as an investment, and it's such a big part of their plans, even though we probably can't keep exporting. The International Energy Agency and other people say we have to stop extracting this fossil fuel and stop burning this fossil fuel like in the next 10 years. So all of this stuff is what we call stranded investments. It's all going to go bankrupt in the next couple of years if we're going to hit our carbon goals and actually eliminate global warming pollution from our electric sector by 2035, which is what President Biden and Governor Whitmer and lots of other people say we should be doing. But it would require the early phase out of a lot of this stuff. And many of these programs are just getting permitted and just getting built. You know, FERC is actively reviewing dockets on a number of these facilities right now. So they're not even in the construction stage yet. Not satisfied with the narrative that we're telling, the gas industry also has been staffing up on what I would call bribery. They would call lobbying or public relations. But basically what they're doing is they're buying off a bunch of Democratic politicians, especially ones who already lost their campaigns for election, and so they don't have another job right now. They are not the governor or a senator somewhere, and so they're giving them lots of money to go around and say that natural gas is really good and natural gas is really clean, and to support things like the Duke Energy Carbon Plan and the DTE Energy Integrated Resource Plan, which are very, very heavily reliant on natural gas as part of getting to what they say is a lower carbon or a more renewable based energy portfolio. But you're going to hear this over and over and over again. And it's going to be a lot of people who seemed like they would be, reasonable and are going to be very close to Governor Whitmer, who's a Democrat, but an elected governor from Michigan, and President Biden, who's a Democrat, but an elected official at the federal level. And it's going to have a lot of influence over who gets appointed to those utility commissions, who gets appointed to FERC, who gets appointed to these positions in charge of regulation, is these people, right? Because they're fundamentally the ones who are going to make the calls and are going to be put in the positions of power to oversee these utilities. And the gas industry's whole game, the reason we call them fossil fuel fascists is the whole point here is to just entrench and hold on to the power of the fossil fuel industry. They want to keep us reliant on them and force us to continue paying them money and giving them political power as long as humanly possible, right? Back to that shutoff report. This is not about safe, reliable, affordable power. You hear those words a lot from utilities and from utility regulators, but these companies are paying billions of dollars in dividends to investors and to CEOs and to lobbyists and to bribes to these people, and they are spending nowhere near that much money on making sure that people's lights actually stay on and that their heat actually stays working in the winter. They are much more invested in holding on to money and power than they are in keeping electricity working, keeping utilities functioning, and serving the public at large. So this was the basic critique of the original article and of kind of where we're at. People looked at that DT Energy integrated resource plan and said, hey, more money for renewable energy, that's nothing but good. Faster retirements of coal plants, that's nothing but good. And then they said, therefore, it must be a good plan and we must be moving in the right direction. My critique is, there is some good news in there and we are moving in the right direction as opposed to standing still. But we're not moving nearly fast enough and we're not investing nearly enough in renewables. And as a result, we are projected to miss the targets around clean electricity, 100% clean electricity by 2035, 50% reduction in global warming pollution by 2030. And that would mean we are nowhere near on pace to arrive at the net zero or zero emission goals by 2050. And the fundamental reason why I think that is the case is that the Inflation Reduction Act is giving too much money and power to utilities who already have too much money and power. They're spending billions on lobbying Democratic politicians who couldn't even win an election. And so they're out here not doing good for communities. They're out here pursuing profit over people, profit over planet. And it's basically giving them more money to do that with and more power politically to do that with. Second reason why this is not a good news story yet is that the people who are overseeing those utilities, the state PSCs and PUCs and FERC at the federal level, are what we call captured regulators. They are not actually independently regulating these utilities. They aren't going back and saying, hey, that carbon plan isn't good enough, Duke Energy. Hey, DT Energy in Michigan, this is a good start on a renewable energy plan, but we need more investment in renewables, less investment in fossil fuels, more investment in communities, less investment in dividends, right? Nobody is pushing back on these folks. The foxes are guarding the hen house. They are owned as subsidiaries of the corporations they are supposed to regulate, however you want to say it. And the big thing is that shutoff report really lays bare is even when it includes things like we will turn off your lights and your heat in the winter, there is still no pushback. The utility regulators supposedly will not force corporations to sacrifice profit in order to provide basic life-saving services to communities. And it goes without saying, the communities hit hardest by utility shutoffs and by this predatory utility policy are communities of color, low-income communities, and especially communities in the southeastern US, where you have big concentrations of low-income and communities of color who are also paying some of the highest utility rates in the country. And then the last thing I think is that when we took away that clean electricity payment program, we took away the idea of penalties for bad behavior in the Inflation Reduction Act, but we left in all the tax subsidies and the credits, and especially a lot of tax subsidies for this speculative false solution kind of stuff like carbon capture, hydrogen power, nuclear reactors, those kind of things. They are really incentivizing dangerous false solutions at the same speed as they're incentivizing renewable energy. And the hope was that utilities would go, okay, we see you putting money into both of these things, but either we will only take the renewable energy subsidy and not lean so heavily on the fossil fuel subsidy, or that they wouldn't, or that they would take both of those subsidies, but that the renewable energy would just end up being cheaper and therefore they would invest more in it. And what you see with that DT Energy versus Duke Energy plan is that basically they're just a range of bad choices, right? The best case scenario for how to use the Inflation Reduction Act probably looks like the DT Energy plan, right? Which is it does phase out coal a little faster, but because it's investing in fossil gas and in renewables at the same speed, you're building a lot of those, both of those kinds of energy. And one of these kinds of energy we don't want or need in the long term, which is the fossil gas. It does get us farther than we would be standing still. It gets us about 60% renewables by 2042, I think it was, or 2045. But that's versus a goal of 100% renewable by 2035 and greening the entire electricity sector faster. And the worst case scenario looks like that Duke Energy plan, which keeps the coal power running even longer into the 2040s, adds a ton more natural gas, is very speculative. Basically, the Duke Energy plan, the reason it got an F as an initial grade from local utility planners was that it didn't actually ever talk about reducing global warming pollution. It said, yeah, we'll build a bunch of gas, and then sometime after 2030, we'll figure out how to make there not be carbon from it. But there was no intention to build a power plant that had carbon capture on it. They were going to build a power plant, and then someday later they would figure out the carbon thing, maybe. And basically what the Utility Commission said was, that all sounds good, but can you get back to us next year on the maybe of the carbon capture? And so that the Utility Commission approved plan got a D- because at least they did ask about the carbon capture stuff. They did ask how they were going to get the carbon out of all these new natural gas plants. But at no point did the Utility Commission in North Carolina require them to clean up their act or reduce pollution or say, only present us a plan with renewable energy. It was very much just another rubber stamp from another utility regulator. But back to where we wanted to expand on this a little bit. Sam from Evergreen Action did, one of his critiques was that I hadn't been around talking about the Clean Energy Payment Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. That's mostly just sad for Sam because he didn't think to look around and hear critiques from other people. He presumed that if he didn't see you making an argument about the Clean Energy Payment Program, then you must not have been making it, or you hadn't been here, you weren't a real person. But the second part of his argument was, I think, somewhat fair, which is it's one thing to say, you know, hey, these plans aren't good enough. It's another thing to say, so what can we do about it? How could we strengthen the plans? And I am pretty critical of FERC and state utility commissions. So, you know, in the interest of not making people feel disempowered, because I do think more people need to be involved in utility policy and regulation. And we do at 109 Methods try and put opportunities in front of you with our monthly FERC actions and stuff like the Duke Energy Carbon Plan. We try and get people more involved in protesting around these things and acting on these things. So I thought I'll sort of expand on my original Twitter thread and give you a couple of things that we can do. One thing that we very much intend to do is to continue being radical. I sometimes talk about this as like the abolitionist version of utility policy. Usually when we talk about abolitionist organizations, we're one at 109 Methods. We're talking about police and the carceral state, that we believe that nobody is free until all of us is free, and therefore part of our mission is bound up in this idea of defunding and dismantling the police state as it exists, so that more people can be free, more people cannot be killed by officers of the state and things like that. And so we do a lot of work. We've been talking a bunch about our comrade Tortuguita, who was murdered by police in Atlanta, defending the forest there and stopping the No Cop City project. So you've heard that, you know, abolitionist theme from us a bit around that in the last little bit, but it also runs through a lot of the actions that we do. You know, when you look at the stuff we've done trying to ban Trump and other fossil fuel fascists from running for office or being part of democratic governance. Obviously, a lot of the stuff we do at FERC, we're trying to dismantle the agency of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and turn it into a federal renewable energy commission that's truly accountable to the public and truly furthers the goals of 100% clean energy. And when you look at actions we do, like the Spark Joy Day of Action to honor our fallen sister, and you know, we were doing things like taking action to the White House and around the Department of Interior, calling on Biden to declare climate emergency, calling on the Department of Interior to reject the Willow Arctic Oil Project, which also took another step backwards this week. So, you know, all these kinds of things are really intended at abolishing the energy system that we have. And we will continue to focus on that goal and to put opportunities and actions and events and things in front of you where you can be part of that. And one coming up just in the next couple of weeks is we are going back to the next FERC meeting. We know we'll be joined this month, February 16 is the meeting. And we're talking to some folks from Freeport because there is a meeting in Freeport just before the commissioners meeting to explain why they're reopening the facility and what they're doing. And we also want to dig in with FERC more and support advocates like the folks from the GTN Express fight on the West Coast who are grappling with what does that change from relying on environmental impact statements to relying on environmental assessments mean for projects that are currently in the FERC docket. We know it means they're trying to make the approval happen faster and with less environmental review. That's the bad part. What can we do to push back on that? How can we convince FERC to change that? And can we do things to disrupt or dismantle the process? Again, that abolitionist approach, can we remake FERC in some way? Can we create a crisis for the agency where they cannot just keep rubber stamping projects? They have to grapple with the impacts of the decisions and the people that are harmed by them. Another one that we've been working on for a long time that we'll be coming back to in the next couple of weeks is focusing on the money. If you remember, the big thing in that Powerless in the US report was comparing these utilities that were shutting off power to customers for failure to pay, and then all the money they were giving back to investors in dividends. And so we've had a long strategy for many years. We've gone to the Duke Energy shareholder meetings. They used to be in person. Now they've been online for the last several years. But we've been a pretty consistent kind of gadfly presence at those meetings, putting pressure on the folks who invest money in Duke and get those dividend benefits back from Duke to pressure the company to change its behavior. There is an argument to be made from a purely financial standpoint. Like if you're an investor in Duke, yes, you could get a big return this year, but in the long run, if climate change destroys civilization, that's not a very good long-term investment. More reasonably sort of for investor types, there is a real risk to being too heavily invested in things like natural gas and gas exports, which Duke is very heavily invested in those industries. And if those things are all going to go kaput, if there's a huge stranded asset to the gas industry in the next 5 or 10 years, that could put your investment very much at risk. And so for years, we've been campaigning at most of the big investors are the big banks. So places like Bank of America, Chase, Citi, those kind of big investment banks are the big funders of fossil fuels, and of the utility companies, which are themselves basically big fossil fuel companies. And so we're going to be doing an action with Third Act, the new group from Bill McKibben and others, that's looking at a sort of intergenerational Third Act being the senior citizen part. But they definitely work with younger activists as well, and activists of all ages. And they're calling for a day of action on March 21st, 3/21/23 is the quick way to remember. It's a palindrome. So March 21st of this year, they'll be doing actions at a bunch of different banks all over the country. And they're inviting folks to join them in planning actions at banks near you. And also to join, as you can see, they have a number of events that are already in planning. And we'll be working with them on all that stuff. And we'll have more resources for you next week on how to find an action, join an action, plan an action, and how we can support you in doing that, again, with an idea of breaking the investment defunding of fossil fuels. Just like we want to defund police, we want to defund the utility regulation system, we want to defund fossil fuels. And so getting the banks to stop investing in this stuff is a big way to do that. And then we have a couple of new ideas, that have come up. These are not totally new, like just this week, but we've been talking since the Inflation Reduction Act passed about trying to deploy into more states. So we talked a bunch about Michigan and North Carolina today. We've done a lot of work, 198 Methods done a lot of work over time in North Carolina because we were part of the fighting the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which has an extension called Southgate into North Carolina. So, we've been working in North Carolina for a while. Michigan, we have not extensively worked in for a long time, but we could potentially ramp up. One of the resources I'm directing people to is that Chisholm Legacy report that talks about public utility commissions, what they are, how they work, who's on them, is really good and has this really helpful appendix at the back, which is like all of the utility commissions in the country with a link to their website. It tells you whether they're elected or appointed and how long the terms are and what the budget, just really helpful stuff for campaign planning. It is probably not feasible for us, next month to scale up and go to all 50 utility commissions meetings. But over time, we would love to build more of that. And we are working in solidarity with activists in North Carolina and in New England and in Oregon and other states to try and figure out how can we get people to the utility commission process, and how do we create points of intervention and conflict there, like we do every month at FERC, going to the meeting and speaking out and bringing people from the front lines to communicate with FERC about that stuff, and then bringing your comments in, a national audience commenting on national energy policy. You can imagine the same kind of thing happening at each and every utility commission in the country. We would need a lot of help to cover all of this ground. And some of them are easier and harder to organize that than others. But we do have roots and connections in a couple of different states. And if you're interested in doing that, we'll put a link in the blog post. You can email us and let us know if you'd like to be part of pressuring your state utility commission. You'd like to find out more about that and how that could work, or if you're already doing that on a local project, like the Duke Energy Carbon Plan was really brought to us by folks in North Carolina. And in fact, we were going to do an event with them. There was a plan, the North Carolina Utility Commission, Duke Energy, NRDC, Department of Energy, a couple of other folks were going to do like a panel discussion in North Carolina and Durham last week. And they canceled it at the last minute once they saw that we were planning a protest. And so suddenly everybody was very busy that afternoon after they heard that there were going to be protesters there. But that's the kind of thing that we can support and we do support all the time, and would love to hear if you have an event coming up where your utility and your utility commission are having a meeting, or they're presenting on a project at a regularly scheduled utility commission hearing. We'd love to help you get there and think through how to do a protest, how to do just go listen and understand the information you're hearing, if that's what you need help with, or otherwise get involved in reviewing things like these integrated resource plans and these carbon plans that the utilities are putting out. And that goes along with, this whole thing started because somebody was talking about the DTE Energy Integrated Resource Plan and how it was specifically talking about the tax benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. So one thing we also know we need to do and build out over the next couple of months is sort of a watchdog process for the Inflation Reduction Act. When utilities are saying, here's how they intend to take advantage of those tax credits or not, or here's how they intend to use the investment money from the Inflation Reduction Act or not, we need more ways for folks to intervene. So we're going to throw up really quickly just a way to get in contact with your governor. Governors, again, in most states, governors appoint the members of the utility commission, like the president appoints the members of FERC, right? And so we'll give a quick way for you to contact your governor as a starting point to start engaging in this conversation. All of this money and all of these tax incentives are in the Inflation Reduction Act. It's law, it's out there. And so what else can we do to encourage governors and state utility commissions, who are appointed by governors usually, to use that money, use it right, and actually invest in people and in communities and in the health of the planet and reducing carbon pollution, not in fossil gas and utility shutoffs and predatory behavior by the utility commissions, which is what they usually do. So that's it. I know there's a little bit of a longer ramble here through things, but like I said, there was a lot of news just this week. A lot of it was bad, but a lot of it does hopefully point a way forward, at least in terms of actions we can take. And stay tuned. We'll have lots more stuff just next week on the upcoming FERC meeting on that third act event targeting the big banks and investors in fossil fuels and utilities. And we're looking for volunteers to get involved in state level campaigns to pressure your utility commissions and or your governors. And we'll start with the governors because that's easier. Most people know who their governor is, that they may not know who all their utility commissioners are. So we'll start with a quick, simple action targeting your governors and just asking the question, do you know the Inflation Reduction Act exists? And are you planning to use the money? And how are you planning to use it? And if you start that conversation with your governor in the next couple of weeks, that'll set you up over the next couple of months to take more actions targeting them. Okay, from 100 Methods, I'm Drew. Thanks for watching.